Tonight, I am so excited to present Cherrie Nolden. Cherrie is with us tonight. She's a full-time farmer in Wisconsin who has raised over 160 Norwegian fjord horses on pasture for over 30 years. Cherrie received her degrees from UW-Madison with a Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Ecology and a Master's of Science in Agroecology. And Cherrie has conducted doctoral research and coursework on immunological management of gastrointestinal parasites of grazing ruminants. Cherrie has several peer-reviewed publications and abstracts from her grazing and agroecology research. Systems thinking and holistic management are of great importance to Cherrie, and she loves helping others create functional management systems. Cherrie, we're so fortunate to have you with us to share your wisdom and your expertise on managing horses on pasture. And with that, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here today and share what I've learned from my years of doing this with folks. And I did put a disclaimer at the bottom here that the views and opinions expressed by me today are mine, because I do know that from my formal education, some of the things I do are not consistent with what I've been formally taught. So don't be surprised if you hear some things that make you scratch your head, and feel free to ask questions about those. That's the way we learn, and it's all about learning and applying things that work really well for keeping our horses healthy and the landscape healthy and us too. So the topic for today is keeping easy keepers can actually be easy. I know there's a lot of people out there who say they should not be called easy keepers because they're so difficult. And I think the way I came into Fjords and easy keeper horses kind of primed me to find how to keep them easily, because I didn't have the formal education before I started raising them. So to give you an outline of what we're going to cover today, I'll do an introduction, much of which Rachel's already presented. My approach to problem solving, some description about our farm, the current farm that we're on now, the management we use, the importance of forage quality, a bit about parasites, diet diversity. I give a summary and then show some of the resources that I've used over the years and found beneficial for developing the approach that I do now. So this is word heavy. The slides from this presentation will be available as a PDF, and you can contact University of Maine and Rachel to get access to those. So my background, my upbringing was basically I'm a first generation farmer. My parents worked in town, had master's degrees, and had a 5-acre hobby farm, and we had our horses in the backyard. Even though they had advanced degrees, we didn't have enough income to board our horses anyplace or send them off for training. So I did all of the raising and training and management of our horses in the backyard of a 5-acre parcel. At that time, it was only like 3 horses. So I've always loved animals. I loved wildlife. I loved nature. 4-H gave me all kinds of opportunities to explore loads and loads of projects, and I love learning and experimenting with things. And so all of that combined allowed me to develop the approach that I have today. The information about breeding fjords, I've bred them since 1991, and all of this is not to brag, it's to give you an idea of where I've been and what experience level I have. Currently, our herd is the largest broodmare, registered NFHR broodmare herd in the United States. We're also the most prolific in terms of producing foals over the last decade. In the last 2 years, we've had 100% conception rate and 100% foaling of those mares without any interventions, no hormones, nothing extra, just pasture breeding, pasture foaling. And I consider that quite an accomplishment, given that reproduction is basically a luxury activity. It's something that the body apportions resources to when everything else is met. So getting that kind of conception just indicates to me that I figured out how to manage these animals optimally for their needs. I have raised over 160 fjords and managed them on 5 different farms with all different soil types over the last 33 years. And most of those farms were in Wisconsin. One of them was in Kansas. I also have experience with, since I was a child in the Kansas City area, my grandmother owned a farm down there. So currently we have 25 broodmares and fillies combined. There's only 21 of those that are reproductive age right now, and we keep 6 stallions. Our genetics in these horses are no different than the genetics of the general fjord population out there. The reason that we successfully manage them on pasture is just because we meet their needs. We haven't selected for individuals that are more or less capable than everything else that's out there in the breed. Rachel went over my education, and so on the right, I can give you just a quick snapshot of overall what our production system involves in our management system. Our horses are kept in herds all the time. We don't have them in stalls. We don't have them individually housed. If they aren't with some other horse, they're with some other group of animal, including sheep, goats, dogs, chickens, that sort of thing. They're on pasture 24/7. We don't have them even in winter. We don't have them in stalls or in barns. They have shelters if they're on a side of the farm that doesn't have ravines and trees. And if they're on the other side of the farm, they have ravines and trees as their shelter. Pasture is 100% of their forage, their feed during the grazing season here. And during the winter, they're bale grazed. We breed them in the pasture, we foal in the pasture in the middle of the herd. We don't pull them out to separate the mare and put cameras on her and that sort of thing. We give them free choice forage, which I know a lot of people are find concerning, that horses shouldn't be able to have access to free choice forage, but that works well in the system. We have free choice minerals. We make them walk, so a bit different than a typical beef rotational grazing system where you want to minimize the walking. We actually want to optimize and increase the amount of walking that our horses do. So we make their resources further away from where they graze to encourage natural exercising. We don't feed any grain. All of these horses, from weanlings, babies, all the way up to 20-plus-year-old brood mares and stallions. We had the oldest was a 27-year-old stallion that we've had, don't get any grain. And so we are adjusting forage quality to meet their needs rather than feeding grain. We don't use muzzles or any kind of restrictions for access to forage. We make our own hay, and then when we want to go riding or driving, we just go out to the herd, pull the animals out that we want to ride and drive, go do the things with them, and then dump them back in the herd. And that works out really well. So Easy Keeper equine challenges are things that I've learned about in explaining to people what we do and getting all kinds of quizzical looks and questions as to how we can make it work the way we do. So I've learned what other people have as challenges, and most of these challenges are things that I've encountered slightly, but just in the way I grew our herds from small, very few animals to a larger number, and on different farms, I've been able to set up different systems to address these challenges, and they really haven't been such challenges for us, though. So generally out there, what I'm seeing is people with the Easy Keeper equines say they can get really fat really easily. They can founder, colic, have insulin resistance, Cushing's disease development, fatty liver, allergies, lameness, chronic inflammation. These things are not common in our herd. We just don't have issues with them. And then the owners out there are working hard and doing their best to provide the best conditions for their horses. And so they're doing all kinds of interventions and effort and studying and wringing their hands. And so they're clipping, spraying, picking manure, removing grass from tracks and access areas, using muzzles, nets, sprays, coats, masks, leggings to keep bugs away, lots of mud management. They have all kinds of concerns with hay and feed uncertainty and finding what they need. finding all kinds of conflicting information out there. And today I'll be providing some more conflicting information relative to what you probably hear predominantly presented out there. Lots of failed approaches. And I think some of the reasons why we can do what we do is we have solutions to some of those failed approaches. Experiencing lots of high vet bills and having challenges with boarding facilities that may or may not manage the horses in the same way that you want to manage them. So our approach to problem solving with the fjords and everything on our farm is a holistic approach. And it's a systems management approach that considers economic aims, social aims, ecological aims, working on making things equitable, livable, viable. Generally, what we're doing is we aren't certified organic, but we're mostly organic, non-chemical, natural approaches. We want low input type approaches too. We don't want to be spending tons of money on vet bills and all of these interventions. We want low stress for the animals and for ourselves and for the environment. Optimal nutrition for the animals, clean air, clean water, individual choices, and targeted health for the individuals, diversity. We don't want to do product substitution. So instead of a chemical fly spray, we use an organic fly spray. We just don't do that substitution. We just don't do fly spray. And we also want our system to be easy and affordable. And so that's how I've kind of developed what I do. Our current farm is 130 acres total, but the horses only use 30 acres of that. On the left, the 2018 Google Earth image shows the 50-acre base home farm, and then in blue, 80 acres of silvopasture that's in development. And then by 2020, we had logged a bunch of that silvopasture and we had put a lane into the main home farm. That's that curved section in the center of the red outline. And the acreage that is grass and trees around that, in a circle around that lane, is where we keep the horses all the time. So the silvopasture is all for goats and sheep and that sort of thing. We use electric fence and we use temporary paddocks. So on the far left, the image, the red is permanent fencing that is woven wire with a high tensile hot wire on the top. And we can click into that high tensile hot wire from any location around the perimeter to electrify the cross fences. And we intentionally keep all that area where the blue lines are open, so I can make those paddocks any shape I want, any size I want, and target the animals in certain areas at certain times. On the right, you can see the picture from yesterday, I think. The horses are in a new paddock. I just turned them into that. The paddock on the left is showing the residue and residual grass that's left in the paddock after I moved them out of there. Since we have foals, we use electronet, and different than cows, if a foal goes under a single strand of hot wire, our mares will go after the foal and go through the single strand of hot wire, no matter how hot it is. So the electronet keeps the foals in, and if the foals are in, the mares are in. So that's why we use the electronet. It also works really well for sheep, goats, and livestock guardian dogs to keep them where we want them. So it's a little bit more challenging to put up, but it works really well for our system here. Like I said, we have lots of different other species that we include in the farm system. We bring cows and pigs in as we want beef and pork, raise them up and process them. Or in the past, we've kept the bulls for our neighbors while they kept their cows on pasture. So they didn't have any breedings at the wrong time of year. So we co-graze, we do leader follower. We have sheep and goats in the system all the time, and livestock guardian dogs to keep all of them protected from a fairly large population of coyotes primarily around us. When I'm feeding the horses, I'm grouping them by their metabolic class and typically by sex. So the stallions are all together We do keep the donkeys with the stallions. And then the mares are in their own herd, and most of the foals are kept with the mares. Growth status, once the foals are weaned, we'll typically feed them a higher quality of forage. And we're always watching body condition score and adjusting forage quality based on body condition score to provide, especially during the winter when we're feeding hay, in like this picture on the top in the lane. That's where they're feeding they're eating from the round bales there at that time. We want to provide the type of forage that's required to keep their body condition in not too fat and not too thin, just right. And then our stallions live as a bachelor herd. Most of them live together. We only have one that doesn't get along with the other boys, and he lives with sheep and goats and is very happy with that. The forage we provide is diverse. It's not certified, but it's organic. We haven't sprayed it. We planted it ourselves. We harvested ourselves. We fertilize it with manure. Typically that's scraped from this lane or local manure from other farmers. The hay that we make in the winter, or that we make during the summer and then feed during the winter, we test every batch of it so we know what quality is, and we can put different quality of forages out for the right group of animals during our bale grazing, which is how we apply fertility to certain section of the pasture every winter. But that testing is really important, because if we feed too high quality forage during the winter, they get too fat, and then they could have metabolic problems grazing during the summer. And then during the summer, they're just on pasture 24/7 out there eating grass and no hay or any grain or any other supplements. We do provide free choice buffet minerals. So they're eating those as they need them. And then we have located this lane in the landscape. You can see it's from the top picture, it's on the top of the hill. It's sloping down away from the lane, so there's good drainage, and horses like to be up in the top of the landscape to just natural comfort zone for them. So that's where we place this. It also doesn't eat up a lot of acreage. It's only a half an acre with this 20-foot lane that's 150 or 1,053 feet long versus a perimeter track or something of that nature, which would take up much more acreage and reduce the amount of acreage that we have to feed the horses. So from a grazing approach, we try to be very adaptive. We're definitely rotational. We're responsive to animal needs and forage needs, and then also as the seasons change, and like last year we had a drought, this year we're having lots of excess rain, responsive to the conditions that are out there, and always keeping our bigger goals in mind. So this kind of light green area is the acreage that the horses have to graze. Some of that is woods, as you can see, and some of it is open pasture. It's only like 23 acres of open, high quality pasture, and the rest of it is dense woods that we keep opening up a little bit each year. When we're grazing in the spring, we turn them out to graze for the rest of the season based on the maturity of the forages. And we just provide the free choice dry hay when the forage quality of the pasture is not mature enough. We don't do a slow transition to grass. A lot of people will take horses out and hand graze them to get them accustomed to grass. We just let them, so our horses, when they're feeding free choice, they have periods of time during the day when they're eating and periods of time during the day when they're just standing around sleeping and digesting. There's a morning period when they're eating, and then around 11 till noon, they tend to just stand around digesting and sleeping. So once they've filled up for the morning, in the spring, we'll turn them out at that point, and then we just rotationally graze them for the entire rest of the summer and don't feed any more hay. And then we typically size our paddocks for a 1 to 3 day duration. The herd isn't in one location any longer than 3 days. Typically 1 to 2 days is what we're doing right now. And that allows us to avoid selective regrazing and overgrazing. It avoids compaction, digging, and provides, with every shift in paddock, abundant diversity and fresh forages. We use that central lane for mineral and water. It's exercise. It helps maintain the hooves on the horses, gets them just moving. And for brood mares, it's really beneficial for them to be moving. It's 20 feet wide, so we can drive a tractor and baler or manure spreader or truck and trailer down that lane out into the middle to load something up if necessary. The vet can go out there in his truck. We plow it with a plow during the winter, so the horses don't just walk over the fence when we get snow accumulation. But we can also pull out a manure spreader and get fertility out there if we need to. Now, what we do has some similarities to the equiculture ideas and the paddock paradise or track system ideas. I didn't encounter those ideas until I joined Facebook, which was in 2016, and then slowly figured out how to become social in today's world. But those systems have similarities, but they also have significant differences from the way we do things. And what I do works for us. And clearly the approaches that they have and that they promote in their systems work for them in their contexts. And this context is a little different, and so we have slightly different approaches. And so this kind of light green area of growing things supports 45 to 50 horses on that total 30 acres in the last 2 years. We've grown the herd to that size. I initially thought we could only support about 20 brood mares and maybe 4 stallions, but our forage management, our pasture management has created such a yield boost and a yield increase that we can support now 25 mares. Even in last year's drought, we didn't have to take the horses off pasture. A lot of beef people were taking their animals off pasture, but our management produced enough yield that we didn't have to pull them and feed them hay somewhere else without overgrazing the pasture. So that to me is an indicator that we're not overstocked. This lane along the ridge, like I said, is for exercise and hoof function. It's located where horses like to stand, and it was actually cost shared through NRCS Equip, which is a USDA program, and it's the practice is called a heavy use area protection, or the 561 practice. So this, if you're in the United States, is a practice that grazers typically use. And when you get cost share for something like this, the grazing plan goes along with it. And usually you're planting cropland to perennial forages and that sort of thing. This link here takes you to that practice sheet, so you can find out more information about that. And we use that. You can see in these pictures here. This is Becca. She's one of our pregnant brood mares. This is Mathis. This is one of our stallions. And we have them with tractive collars on them. I just have a cow collar with a tractive unit vet wrapped to the cow collar. And they have access to the paddocks that we make. And then in this picture here, if you can see my pointer, at the end of the lane, there's a bunch of little blobs. Those are all horses. And then there's some horses, when this picture was taken, that are moving off in this direction into the pasture. But these tractive collars give me an idea with this lane that's only a fifth of a mile long, 0.2 miles long and 20 feet wide, how much activity these horses are doing. And so what we're seeing is Mathis here, the stallion that's in the mare herd. These are screenshots of 24-hour periods of activity. And so this top left picture, Mathis traveled 2.95 miles. The end of the lane down here has a water tank. The end of the lane down here also has a water tank right now during the summer. Minerals are here and salt are down here. And so that was only 3 miles basically. And a different day, a different section of the pasture. So this circle here is where the end of the lane is. It's right here in this picture. Um, they had access to this paddock area during this period, and he traveled 8 miles that day in that 24-hour period. So Becca, the pregnant mare, that's also living in the mare herd. So Mathis is living out there in the mare herd right now, and these are all from June this year. Becca on one day only also traveled around 3 miles, basically in the same areas where Mathis did. And then the time that Mathis traveled 8 miles, Becca also traveled about 8 miles that day. So the horses are using the area and exercising themselves. We also currently have two donkeys, one mini, one standard. And so I was curious. Tito is our mini donkey. He's living with the sheep in the woods right here right now. And he put on 8 miles in that 24-hour period, just perusing around and looking for food and predators and whatever mini donkeys do out there. This I thought was really interesting. Jeff Brink, a retired ARS USDA Dairy Forage Research Center researcher, shared this with me. This is not new. This rotational grazing and managing animals this way is not new. So in 1777, James Anderson, a Scottish agriculturist, was quoted saying, "Animals delight most to feed on fresh pasture. Cattle supplied with this kind of food would be quickly fatted. A farmer should divide his land into 15 to 20 equal divisions, stop his beasts from roaming indiscriminately, and put the whole number of his beasts into one of these divisions. Have the number of beasts so great as to consume the best part of the grass in one day. Give them fresh park every morning to repeat the same repast. Have so many parks as days required to advance the grass to the proper length after being eaten fair down, so that the first field would be ready to receive them after going over all the others, so that they might be carried round in a constant rotation." So, I mean, the rotational grazing stuff is not anything new. And what I would interject is after the cattle are discussed, we can discuss how to include goats, sheep, horses into this kind of system too. So I would say run sheep or goats ahead of dry cows. So if you have cows that you don't need to get fat, because if they're dry, they don't need extra energy and you don't want them too fat or they won't breed back. Or easy keeper horses, and let the more selective grazers, those goats and sheep, cream the most digestible parts, leaving behind the lower energy density parts for the classes and species needing lower quality. Alternatively, allow forages to mature before grazing them by the animals with the lower metabolic demand. Place resources at a distance to induce exercise in those needing it. That would be my way to make this more specific to how we manage our animals for success. But really, this is a system that's been done for centuries, decades. So one of the things that I think is really different in the way I've come to manage the horses is I think about forage quality in a different way than I think a lot of equine nutritionists or some of the louder, more vocal equine nutritionists out there think of it. So often, folks are talking about the cell contents. So this picture in the background shows plant cells, and the cell contents are here inside the cell walls. Typically, what I see people talking about is sugars and ESC plus starch, and those are components of the cell contents. When I'm thinking about managing forage nutritional quality for our horses and various other animals, I'm thinking more about the cell wall, the neutral detergent fiber component, the thing that encapsulates all of these cell contents. And when that encapsulation is lignified, cell contents become less available. It also slows down passage rate and makes the animal feel full. So for me, managing cell wall and focusing on cell wall is more important than focusing on the cell contents. Grasses and legumes have different cell content proportions and also cell wall proportions. And within those cell walls, so the green section of the two top circles are the proportion of cell wall for legumes versus grasses. There's different digestibilities of that cell wall for legumes versus grasses. So the digestible neutral detergent fiber for grasses is a greater proportion of that cell wall content than it is for legumes. And also legumes tend to have less cell wall compared to the cell contents. And so horse pastures that have a greater predominance of grass and less legume have overall less cell content and would be a less rich pasture than pastures that have a large legume content. And if you have overgrazing and compaction of the soils, at least in our part of the world, what typically grows is a large number of legumes and a small amount of grass, and typically short grass like Kentucky bluegrass. And so that becomes a really imbalanced and hard to manage diet for easy keeper type horses. So that's why we primarily focus on the grasses in our system. And when we have really tall, robust grasses, the legumes maintain their component in the system, but they aren't a predominant aspect. They add diversity, they add protein, and different digestibility with all the different plants out there. So we have this understanding of the way these forages are different, and management can impact the way those forages affect our horses. So I'm often looking at neutral detergent fiber, but alone neutral detergent fiber isn't sufficient to assess quality. What we want to know is how digestible that neutral detergent fiber is. And so on the left is percent digestibility for the green bars, neutral detergent fiber, or the percent digestible that that fiber actually is. So for tall fescue, it has 47% digestible or NDF, and then the digestibility of that NDF is more around 68% or so. And so often I'm managing for orchard grass in our system. We have all of these species, but I like orchard grass because it's a bunch grass and it produces a lot of yield and tends to have pretty moderate digestibilities, and the cow people don't like it really well because of that. It's not quite as digestible as they would like, but it's great for the fjords. And often I show people this chart, and this to me kind of encapsulates the understanding of digestibility interaction with forage intake and yield for both legumes and grasses. So the digestibility line is what I have highlighted in yellow, and digestibility declines as on the bottom we can see the growth stages of the grasses and legumes. So grasses go from leafy early growth to boot to heading and to blooming. And over that development of the grass, the digestibility decreases. The yield increases. So this curved line shows yield increasing over time, which is great because that feeds our horses. But also what you see is this intake, this dashed line of intake declines simply because intake is limited by passage rate and physiological fill capacity. So when a plant is less digestible, it takes longer for it to pass the KD rate through the digestive tract of the animal. And animals stop eating once they've reached their physiological fill capacity. Some ponies have a higher physiological fill capacity than horses. That's been documented in literature, but the digestibility can determine how much intake that animal can make from a particular sward, and the maturity of those plants has a large part to say in how much they can done is just match the metabolic needs of the horse with the maturity of the forages that we're grazing. So I go out and I look at their pastures and say, okay, is this mature enough for this group of horses? If it is, I put them out. If it isn't, I wait until it gets more mature. Or I pre-graze it with sheep and goats that are more selective, and they will eat off the more digestible parts and leave behind the parts of the plant like the stem that are less digestible. And then the horses can immediately follow the goat or sheep grazing and eat those less digestible parts. There's also seasonal changes in forage quality. So the neutral detergent fiber in green in early in the spring in May typically starts off quite low, which means that it's not a lot of cell wall in the plant material that's being eaten. It's very soft, very lush. And as you get towards June, the NDF increases and makes it more cell wall, more of a upright, durable plant that's going into reproductive status. The digestibility of that neutral detergent fiber declines over that time. As you're heading into that reproductive status, and it's really, really high early in the spring, which is why the fleshy forages are difficult for easy keeper horses, because it's just too digestible and they get too much energy from their diet. And basically it's like eating candy bars versus eating broccoli. Also during that time, as you move from May through June, the crude protein content as a percent of the dry matter decreases. Often also, I'm thinking in dry matter. It seems like a lot of folks like to think in terms of as fed basis. And when dealing with forages, I guess the courses and everything I've taken, dry matter makes sense. Everything is reduced to a dry matter basis, and it's easy to compare. It's easy to look at percentages and that sort of thing. So that's usually, if I'm talking about percentages, it's on a dry matter basis here. And then there's in like a second grazing after we've done one rotation, plants have a gap of time to grow back. Then the NDF remains fairly constant over July through August. The digestibility only declines slightly compared to digestibility earlier in the season. And the crude protein also declines less than it did earlier in the season. And then again, another gap for growing the forages back before grazing again. And then we can see how those digestibilities and neutral detergent fiber changes. This data is not published, but is a set of data from Dr. Jeff Brink from the USDA Dairy Forage Research Center. And he was kind enough to share his slides with me to share with you guys what I've actually seen out in the pasture. And he actually has data now to show that. So to give you some indicators of that I use for when I graze, I often see people talking about, well, you should graze when the grass reaches the height of a beer bottle. Our grasses are reaching the height of a beer bottle stacked on top of a wine bottle, and they're still not in that stage, at 3-leaf stage. To me, they're not mature enough for my horses to graze that. So height is not, for me, an indicator that I use for timing for grazing. What I do use is phenological changes, morphological changes in these plants as they go from immature to mature stages of development. And often I'm looking for collared leaves. So the number of leaves circled here in red that have a collar and the leaf moving off of that collar as the plant is moving into reproductive status. So you can see here a flower head emerging from the stem. And this plant has 4 leaves. Once it's reached 3-leaf stage, it's finally refurbished all of its energy stores in its roots, and it's now growing completely from photosynthesis and growth from those what's produced in those leaves. So I wait at least until after 3-leaf stage. Most cow folks do too, but then I prefer to move into 4-leaf, 5-leaf, up to 8-leaf stage based on how efficient or not efficient the horses are that I'm grazing. Donkeys, really, really mature. Foals, less mature. So the 4 to 5-leaf stage, this list over here, shows generally what I'm shooting for in matching that forage quality to the animal needs from a metabolic perspective. So lactating goats, growing kids, lambs, and calves at that 4 to 5 leaf stage, the 5 to 8 leaf stage, that's where our lactating mares, our ewes, our replacement does, and ewes are typically targeting for grazing in our system. And then that 8 leaf to flowering to seed set, the dry mares, geldings, non-working horses, efficient horses, donkeys, that's a good stage of maturity for them. And then if we're early in the spring or late in the fall, or we've come out of a drought and grasses are growing again, the new growth is really lush. And I don't want the really efficient horses eating that. So I would cream that stand before letting the horses in by sending the goats or sheep or both in for 6 to 12 hours and then immediately following with 6 to 12 hours of horse grazing. And that way we can get the very selective creatures, the goats and sheep, eat the leaf and those really highly digestible parts and leave behind the less digestible. When we're feeding, this data shows stocking rate, I have circled here, in acres per animal unit month. So often we're talking about number of horses per acre. Sometimes it's one, sometimes for us, it's usually 1 acre per horse that works for our farm, or even less, 0.7. Typically planning groups would have you think about 2 to 5 acres per horse, depending on in a temperate area like where we are in zone 4. Drier areas, obviously, more acres needed for animals. And so since this was done in the Dakotas, they typically talk in acres per animal unit month. And so if we look at season-long grazing, so set stocking or not rotational grazing, and grazing starting before the 3rd leaf, or season-long grazing starting grazing after the 3rd leaf is produced, and then comparing that to twice over rotational grazing starting after the 3rd leaf. So this would kind of be like the control and undesirable approach. And then the second column would be at least waiting until the plant has restored its energy reserves and its root system. And then the third option would be rotating instead of set stocking. And what we can see is that there's a 29% increase in stocking rate if we get if we give rotation to that pasture stand instead of set stocking. So there's definitely improvements that can be made with rotational grazing. And although this is focused on cows and calf productivity and income from calves, the same thing works for horses. Much of what I've developed and learned and applied to our horses is stuff that I've learned about cows and goats and sheep and just general pasture management. And with slight modifications, we can apply those same concepts and achieve the goals that we have for the horses that might be slightly different than the goals for the cows or goats or sheep, but just little modifications make a big difference and can help us net income or benefits that, at least in this system, it was 53% increase in net return by including rotation and waiting to graze until after the 3-leaf stage. The other thing that we don't do in our system is graze too short. So we want to leave residue. In the picture on the left, there's enough residue. If you graze it off at the dashed line, there's enough residue in this plant material down here that this plant can grow by photosynthesis. If the graze is shorter, so it's closer to the root system and deep into this plant's growing areas, then the plant has to regrow based on stored fuel, basically starch that's in the stem here. Legumes pull it from their roots, the grasses pull it from their stem and the starch there. And this happens when there's little to no residue because plants get grazed too short. The problem with doing this is that it increases the time it takes for that plant to recover and be available to grow, to be grazed again. So this chart shows the residue height effects on yield distribution of mature orchard grass. That was the plant that was in those prior pictures. If the residue left behind is the blue lines are 2 inches, the orange lines are 5 inches, or the residue for the yellow lines is 10 inches. And all of that grazing happens in May, the end of May. We give the plants time to rest to get back to 20 inches tall, and which was the starting height for grazing, and then graze them again to that residue, either blue 2 inches, orange 5 inches, or a 10-inch residue left for the treatments that are in yellow. It takes 80 days for that 2-inch short grazed area to grow back to 20 inches, whereas the areas that were given a little more leaf area for photosynthesis with a residue of 5 inches took 60 days to grow back. And in the treatments where we leave 10 inches of residue, the plants only needed 55 days to get back to a grazable height. So this allows us to one, produce more yield, and two, graze more often. And the other thing that this set of charts doesn't show is that if we're grazing this far out into October, it's going to be late May, maybe even into June in the following year before that orchard grass that got set back to, again, 2 inches short at the end of October is going to be recovered and grown back that it can be grazed again. So it delays our turnout ability in the spring if we're grazing short like this. We need to leave more height on the plants when we're grazing them. And we can do that with horses. It's just about management. A lot of folks out there would say that that horses can't be managed the way cows or goats or sheep or any of these other animals can be. And they can be. They definitely can be. We do it all the time here. I have for decades. In our pastures, we really embrace diversity. We want all of these species. The pasture condition scoring sheets for NRCS would look at this and say, oh, there's so many weeds out there. Some of them are toxic, and we have to give this pasture a poor condition score if it has all this out there. To me, I'm loving these secondary plant compounds that are coming with all of these plants. And people always ask me what species we have in our pasture. We planted some, but the most of what's out there is volunteers. And we don't spray out the volunteers. Some of them, yes, if they were eaten in a large abundance, could be toxic, but none of it's out there in such abundance. And if we manage our pastures for tall grazing and sufficient rest periods, then the grasses predominate. And a lot of these are just small components that the animals eat a little bit at a time and never have had any toxicity issues or anything problematic from them. So a lot of these plants have secondary plant compounds that produce health in the animals. And Native Americans have used these plants for these reasons for many years. And then when we developed health system with powerful antibiotics and things like that, we kind of moved away from using these secondary compounds in all these plants. But these are just some plants that are native around here. Wherever you live, there will be plants that naturally grow around you that have useful secondary plant compounds for you, for the horses, for the whole system. So there's antiviral, diuretic, vermifuge, expectorants, liver bitters, alternatives, astringents, tonics, anti-inflammatories, anti-flatulents, diaphoretics, demulcents, laxatives, all of these anti-fever. These plants have so many things that are useful. And usually the reason that they have these is to protect themselves from insect damage or predation from the grazers. So this protects the plant, doesn't allow the animal to overeat. These are often considered anti-nutritive qualities if you look in the literature. But in little bits, it's very beneficial health-wise to the animals. Also, these plants are quite comparable, sometimes even better than some of the other domesticated and planted species for protein and various other components that can be really useful to our livestock. And horses definitely, ours eat lots of burdock, and that can be 29% protein. And for those who are concerned that the protein is going to be too high in the diets of the animals, that will definitely increase the quality of the diet, and they can get more energy from their diet if they're eating a higher component of protein that's not tied up in a bunch of lignin, so it's inaccessible. But it also, at least in sheep and goat world, increases IgA, which helps with parasite resistance. So that high protein in the diet is beneficial. And we can compare that to the bolded alfalfa, orchard grass, brome are things that are planted, but locust leaf, willow leaf, grape leaves. The horses eat all these things. They do eat some nettles, not as much as like the sheep and goats do, but anyway, and then switchgrass, blue stem, native warm season grasses tend to be lower in protein content. So these phytochemicals, this next set of slides is courtesy of Stefan von Vliet, who was a postdoc of Dr. Fred Provenza, who has some books out there on nutritional wisdom and the benefits of all of these secondary compounds and balancing each other and helping the animals, especially wildlife, meet their genetic potential, living out there, selecting their own foods, and trying to keep themselves as healthy as possible. So these are plant-produced metabolites that have biologically active compounds, and they interact with the animals that eat them and the insects that would have been eating on those plants. And they can have good, they can have bad properties. And there's thousands of these plant secondary compounds. Some of the main ones are terpenes, phenols, tocopherols, and carotenoids. And the more diversity, and this is published research that the diet of the animals have in phytonutrient content, the more that is in their meat and their milk. So in their muscle tissue, in the milk, the foals that are drinking milk from our mares are getting a more diverse, phytochemically rich milk than horses that the mares are just eating a monoculture of timothy or maybe some alfalfa thrown on the side. So they're getting all these benefits through the milk, and they're accumulating it in their tissues, which then their body uses to help them in a health perspective. There is a direct relationship between those phytochemicals and in the forages and meat and milk. And we can also see from this chart that the forage polyphenol content on the x-axis versus the milk polyphenol content on the y-axis, all of these stored forages have lower polyphenol content relative to a grassland pasture that is a fresh pasture. So fresh forages are more beneficial to our cattle, our goats, our sheep, but also to our horses and to us humans than the stored forages. So we can get much higher polyphenol content of the milk in our lactating mares by having them on fresh forage than even feeding those same plants in a dried form. So again, here's some data showing relative for goat milk, cheese, and beef, grass-fed on fescue in the green bars versus grain-fed corn or hay and concentrate for the goats, and the differences in phytochemical content or polyphenols in the cheeses and meat. And here are some particular phenolic compounds that this one is anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and then the other two are antioxidant. But comparing diversified pasture in the green bars to a TMR that is hay and grain, and hardly any of those, if any of those polyphenols. So increasing the diversity of the diet is beneficial to the content of these polyphenols, these secondary plant metabolites for the animals and for the consumers of those. And for us as horse owners, it's not about the products that they're producing, but their health, and therefore the lack of money we have to spend on veterinary intervention. And then also, when we, as part of our system, put up our own hay, we're putting up hay on land that we rent, that we interseeded with a diversity we encouraged by not spraying everything that wants to grow there. And we harvest that and bale it up and feed it to our horses in winter. The content of that forage is going to be lower on a polyphenol content relative to forages that are fresh, but it's still far more diverse than what is typically fed to most horses around the country. People trying to control a monoculture type forage for mixing or for managing what they feed during the winter. And also I've seen a lot of comments about picking manure out of pastures and picking waste out of there, that it'll kill the grass. And this is a picture from few days ago from a paddock that we grazed, I don't know, 2 weeks ago. You can already see grass pushing through the manure that has been rained on. And it's the manure, we don't pick up manure in our pastures. And the grasses don't get killed when the horses poop out there. The grass grows right through it. And then also things that they've eaten germinate and grow through that manure. All right, from the outline perspective, we've covered the first 5 topics, and now we're going to talk a bit about parasites. I studied parasites during my doctoral research and was looking at grazing system parasites and using an immunologically based treatment to train the immune system of the animals to fight off parasites with interleukin 10. And what I learned during that research and in teaching horse parasite management to the undergrads as part of the lab that I was a TA for, there's some things we do in horse parasite management that is not done anymore. It's not a best management practice in goats and sheep, because goats and sheep are very affected by parasites and they die. Most horses aren't so affected by parasites that they die. It's really rare for that to happen. And there's a paradigm shift in thinking that I'm glad to see coming around, that is that parasite infection in these livestock and horses too is normal. They're part of the system. Before we had anthelmintics, the animals managed their parasites by themselves, and we don't need to have a goal of completely cleaning them out. It's actually detrimental because it can increase allergies and autoimmune issues if they're not a host to the type of microbes and insects and things that are normally part of their system. So these parasites, generally, what we want to do is maintain them at a level that does not negatively affect the health of the horses. And there's some horses that are heavy shedders, some horses that aren't. The heavy shedders tend to have a lower immune system that is allowing those parasites to shed more eggs. It's not necessarily that they have more worms in them, but it typically would be because their immune system isn't suppressing the egg output of the parasites that are in them. So my goal with our horses and our land is to not eliminate the parasites, to let the horses manage the parasites themselves, unless the horses are being negatively affected. And it's really rare that happens. It's more often in foals, it's hardly ever in the adults. And by including plants in the pasture system that are anthelmintic or contain anthelmintics, the horses can actually help themselves. And also our buffet of minerals contains copper, and there's one mare in particular who eats a lot of copper, more so than a bunch of the others. And whenever she does that, you can see some strongyls in her manure. The literature does have references about effective anthelmintics and the mechanisms for their activity against the helminths or the roundworm parasites that are in our animals. And so the secondary metabolites that are typically something we want to look for. So I have a set of plants that work in my environment that have these tannins or um, various acids, saponins, terpenoids, caffeic acid. Um, there's all kinds of plants in my environment that have those in them. So we just let those plants be a part of our system. Every different context, every different environment is going to have plants that contain some of these compounds. And so what you would want to do if you don't live in zone 4 in a temperate region like we do, then you would look for plants that grow naturally in your environment that have these contents. And the plants for a future database is a really good one that I've found for that, finding that information. And so in our zone, zone 4, I think Maine has a lot of these same plants. Plants that contain tannins, that contain terpenoids, caffeic acid, or saponins are listed here. And these are all things we can grow and let the horses have access to. Also, Native Americans use dewormers for themselves. And in looking through this Iwagara book, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, American Indian Ethnobotanical Tradition and Science by Enrique Salmon. These are dewormers that were listed in that book and how the Native Americans used them on themselves. So the natives in whatever region of whatever country you live in probably have a similar list of plants that are useful from that region that provide the same benefits. And those can be used in the horses system too. Here, our horses are grazing with sheep and goats and eating black walnut leaves. They eat the nuts that fall, they eat the leaves, no problems with that at all. And there's burdock here in the foreground. We have dung beetles on our farm, and we have them because our system doesn't include deworming of the majority of our animals. So the anthelmintic class of ivermectin is one that kills dung beetles. And so if you avoid using that in the management of parasites in your animals, you will have dung beetles arrive. They just showed up. We didn't plant any of them there. And they're really beneficial because they reduce the need for us to do any kind of spraying or insect management, because these dung beetles actively reduce face flies, horn flies, gnats. They reduce roundworm parasites. They improve forage production in terms of carrying capacity. They improve forage diversity and palatability or utilization by reducing areas of dung that the horses would avoid. Multi-species grazing helps with that too. But there's all kinds of environmental benefits of dung beetles beyond just the horses and us. So for the environment, for the birds, soil structure, soil biology, water infiltration, dung beetles are great. And they definitely thrive up in the north. They decline in activity over winter. We don't have the rollers, the big rollers like they have in Texas, but we have a lot of dwellers and tunnelers. And so I've gone out and figured out what we have in our farm pastures, and we have a group of dwellers and we have a group of tunnelers. The dwellers have their entire life system in the manure pile. So we don't want to disturb the manure pile to get them to lay their eggs, grow larvae. While they're larvae, they eat a lot of the fly parasites and do all of their benefits, and then emerge as adults and reproduce and do it all again. The tunnelers take manure and bury it below the manure pile. They don't roll it away. They just grab a ball and bury it. And so the tunnelers are useful because they are helping shift fertility deeper into the soil profile than just this top applied manure and urine that the horses put out there. This Onthophagus hecate is one of the larger species of dung beetles that we have. It's considered a small tunneler. So they grab a ball of manure and they dig a hole and they create this bioturbation, this upwelling of soil from deep down as they take that manure ball and bury it down in the hole. And if you are feeding biochar or you have biochar in the system and you have soils that have poor cation exchange capacity, the dung beetles can bury um, that biochar deep in the soil profile without having any tillage involved, which is a really useful aspect. Rotational grazing is really good for the dung beetles because the fresh manure is concentrated in those areas that the herd is living in for 1 to 3 days and then moved on and not disturbed until 20 to 70 days whenever you get back to grazing that paddock again. And that's enough time for the dung beetles to fully reproduce. You don't get trampling, and for this reason, we've stopped running chickens behind the horses to scratch manure patties open because we want the benefits of the dung beetles. And here, this picture isn't of dung beetles, but it's strongylls, small strongylls in horse manure that are red, which indicates that they had just been attached to the mucosal lining of the GI tract. And they were shed because this horse ate tannins, ate some plants with high tannin content. And here's one that's white, meaning that it hasn't recently had a blood meal, but all the rest of these are red. So they've just recently had a blood meal and got shed out because the horse chose to eat enough tannins to deworm itself. I didn't treat this horse at all. Mixed or multi-species grazing is beneficial from a parasite management perspective. This is one of the farms that I was on in the past where it was 200 feet of sand, a very sandy place. And so to get even this much Kentucky bluegrass to grow with our bachelor herd, these are sheep, Corsican sheep, 1 buck goat, and in this picture, 4 Fjord stallions, all grazing together in electronet. And the goats don't share parasites with the horses or with cattle. The sheep also don't share parasites with the bigger animals. Goats and sheep do share parasites though. And they do have either complementary or sometimes overlapping grazing activities and preferences. So the sheep compete more with the horses than the goats do. And so I prefer actually having goats and horses together than sheep. And here are winter sacrifice lots. So we have areas where we feed bales over winter that are mainly just to house the animals. We can use the sheep and goats to eat a lot of these weeds, and these weeds are more mineral dense than grasses are, and they are full of secondary plant compounds that are beneficial to the small ruminants plus to the horses. And there's one of the donkeys in the picture there. We do use a mineral buffet, and this is where my nutritionist doctoral research advisor would be very, he'd say, oh, this doesn't work. You can't do this. Well, we're doing it and it does work. And I started this in 2009, experimenting with various types of offerings of different minerals and fully switched to this free choice enterprise buffet in 2019. And all of our horses, goats, and sheep have been on this, the cows that have been here too, for the last 5 years and no other minerals. And so we wouldn't be having the reproductive success that we have or the health and low vet bills and all that sort of thing that we have if the horses were either toxic or deficient on minerals or vitamins also. In this picture here, this is Rurik, this is our red dun stallion. He's eating V4, and V4 is fat soluble vitamins, so A, D, and E. But he has access to these pastures. This is in the end of the lane, and the pasture is full of grass. There should be plenty of vitamins out there. Yet he's in here, he's breeding these mares. He obviously thinks that he needs some more fat soluble vitamins, so he's eating those. Our local soil conditions have given us the opportunities to see the horses doing consumption of types of minerals and vitamins that I can't find anything about in the literature. And to me, this just means that we have some more investigation to do to figure out what it is that are the conditions that these animals are seeking different minerals to buffer their experience of their environment. So our soils are deficient in copper, selenium, iodine, sodium, and cobalt. We have excesses of zinc, molybdenum, iron, and lead. We've had poorly fertilized hay that we brought in, or that we bought when we didn't have the right quality and we needed some lower quality hay. And it turned out to be, after a forage test, really low in phosphorus and potassium. And the horses, as soon as they started eating that, immediately started eating potassium mineral and phosphorus mineral, and increased the amount of A, D, and E, that V4 mineral, and the water soluble vitamins C and B in their buffet. When they're eating fleshy forages that are high in potassium, the horses eat more magnesium. They eat more clay. They eat more iodine to balance out the nitrates. We have plant excesses with our brassicas that are out in the pasture of sulfur. We have nitrates. We have cyanogenic compounds. The clays and various other things that the horses choose to eat can help buffer that. There's a lot recently about iron in horse diets, and our mares, after they've given birth, eat a fair amount of iron. I think they're just refurbishing themselves after delivering that placenta and that big baby. And I haven't found anything in the literature on that, and or recommendations to increase the iron with post-parturition mares. So these are sort of things that this approach reduces my need to modify a mineral that has been balanced to the forages that they're consuming, and provide that modified mineral as frequently as the conditions are changing that would necessitate the horses needing that change in the mineral balance. And that happens so often and so frequently that I'm just happier to put this out and let them eat the things that they want from it. We like the round beef mineral feeders better than these big square ones, and we modify them by sticking a divider in the 3 sections so each round container can hold 6 different minerals. We also put a plain salt block out at all times so they can get what they need. So other people would ask me, like, what are the things that you don't do? So there are a lot of unnecessary practices for our farm that I see elsewhere. We don't do a slow transition to grass. We don't do any meal feeding of balancers or grain. We don't have separate rations by horses, and we don't put them in feeding stalls to feed them. We don't do pasture grooming. We don't pick up manure. We don't mow after the horses have grazed. We leave the tall standing stuff. We don't spray out broadleaves or toxic plants. We don't control the species mix. We put some stuff out there and encourage everything else. We don't aerate. We let the thistles and various other deep-rooted plants soften up the soil, and the root exudates from the grasses to feed the microbes to create the soil structure that makes our soil very spongy. Our chemical deworming frequency is almost nil, except for foals. We don't use grazing muzzles. We don't limit turnout. They're out there all the time. We don't restrict feed. We don't turn out based on sugar levels in the plants. So trying to only let them have access during the morning when it's low sugar. Ours graze 24/7. We don't use fly sheets, boots, sprays, or blocks to manage flies either. And
Hey,
then
Cherrie, I just want to throw out a time check. It is 7:15. And I think we're ending at 7:30. Oh, good.
yep,
You're close.
I'm
Okay,
almost done.
perfect.
Yep. Clarity for your pasture system and your horses is important. So is your pasture exercise space? Or do you want a lawn aesthetic with your pasture? Or do you want like what we have, which is a growing season forage for your horses? Restriction feeding creates all kinds of challenges with horses that are designed to be eating when their body tells them to, and causes some endocrine dysfunction, leptin issues. Often what I'm seeing when people are trying to do non-restriction feeding is their hay is too digestible, or their forages are too digestible, and so then the horses get fat. If you reduce the digestibility of the forages by letting them get mature, or cutting the highly digestible grass or forages that you're feeding during the winter with straw, which is commonly done in dairy cow diets. Um, you can reduce that digestibility and increase the fill feeling that the horse has so they don't eat quite as much. Often the pastures are being grazed or managed at too immature a stage, or they're not being creamed ahead of the horses. The meal feeding or limited grazing causes gorging and anticipation stress in the horses. Often there's insufficient movement, so setting up paddocks to encourage movement can take care of that. If the horses are overweight or insulin resistant, don't put them out on pasture. Get that fixed before you put them out on pasture. And you can do that by getting them accustomed to non-restriction feeding and feeding these lower quality forages. Often people leave horses in paddocks for too long a time, so the forages are grazed too short, and that causes a shift to undesirable species and reduces diversity. Sometimes the paddock rest is too short for the desirable plants to recover. And so often I see recommendations for 4 paddocks for rotation. I think people should have more. We have about 20 some paddocks in our rotation, and we change them in location all the time. Mineral and vitamin deficiencies or toxicities and plant secondary metabolite issues are what can result if the paddocks are overwhelmed with some invasive plants or aren't managed appropriately. We want to have more diversity in the forages that produce health naturally. We want to reduce social stress and isolation, so keeping them in herds. And then grouping animals by their metabolic need helps us to feed them properly so we aren't getting some too fat while others are not getting enough. And in summary, what we do is a holistic or systemic management approach to make things easier for us and to increase our success. And based on the outcomes that we've had, I think we're doing that quite well. We feel that feeding right is really important. So forage quality, looking at body condition response to that forage quality, and managing pastures well. Making sure that the horses are moving, living in a herd is really important for their social and mental and physical well-being. Managing the health in the non-grazing season is really important. If they're too fat over winter, they're not going to be ready to graze forages during the summer, and produces stress during the growing season if they are too fat. And then diversity promotes health. So resources, these are the books that I've found useful. You'll see that the majority of these are not horse books because I haven't found direction on how to do the things that I'm doing in the horse books. What I've done is read approaches that work for other livestock and applied them with the nuances that are successful for easy keeper horses. So it's a different approach, but it's worked quite well. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer questions by text, email, Facebook. I have a website. We have a pasture walk the second Saturday in July. And then coming up on the Maine Extension webinar series is Alicia Harlov, Jamie Garzon, and Alyssa Ballman to talk about more of kind of the things I've touched on here. And with that, I can take any questions folks have.
Wow, that was so wonderful. Really inspirational. I know at my farm I'm in a point of revitalizing our fields and planning our grazing system. So this has just opened my eyes to some of the things that I want to do. I want to look at the Q&A. We have 3 questions here, and they're all related to the mineral buffet. One, I think you answered. It was an early question. What is meant by mineral buffet minerals? So I think you did answer that. The other 2 questions relating is what about adding seaweed as part of the buffet? And then will you please put up the list of minerals? And then where do you source them from?
So seaweed is normally used by a lot of people for iodine source. And so the buffet contains iodine. The thing with seaweed is it also contains a lot of molybdenum, which is an antagonist to copper. So for me, for the cost of seaweed, there's lots of other really beneficial things in seaweed. I don't want the molybdenum that is countering the copper. I want our horses to not have that interaction since we're so copper deficient where we are, and the horses already have to eat more copper here than they would in places near the coasts that might have more copper and also would have more iodine available to them. So it's just a really expensive supplement. And if you don't dilute it with salt, the animals really like it because of other components in it. And so they eat a lot of it. And you can go broke putting out as much seaweed as they want to eat. Uh, which just says that there's something in there that they really like. So for me, I'm both balancing the health of the horses and the economic aspects of it. So I have fed seaweed, I have fed kelp in the past, and my experience and what I'm saying comes from that experience. And then that list of minerals that I have in the presentation is not the entire list of minerals that's in the buffet. If you go to the place where I get our minerals is Free Choice Enterprises. They're in the Midwest and they ship all over the country. Canada has they can't ship to Canada, and I think there's a company in Canada who's providing similar mineral mix, and I don't know their name off the top of my head. And some other companies in other countries are also. And this actually, I started experimenting with it from reading Pat Colby's book on natural horse care, natural goat care, natural sheep care. She's based out of Australia. She's passed away now, but that book kind of was my springboard into all kinds of experimenting with various other um, supplements to provide to the horses. And this buffet of minerals and vitamins are just vitamins and minerals. They're with a little salt and some rice hulls mixed with them, but they are not. Uh, our horses are out in the woods eating prickly ash, eating multiflora rose, eating burdock. There are plants out there that are providing things for them that they're not getting in this mineral buffet. So it's not the end all be all, but it sure, from my perspective, reduces my need to be doing loads and loads of mineral balancing and ordering different mineral mixes to provide to the horses to meet the book values of what it says they need. When what I've seen is that there are things that the book doesn't cover that the horses are adjusting for with that mineral buffet and with all of the plant secondary compounds that they're eating out there. I think that answered the questions.
I would say so. Thank you. The next question is, how do you manage ticks?
So just like with internal parasites, external parasites don't like an animal that it has a healthy immune system. And by consuming sulfur, copper, and things like wormwood or some of these other deworming, these anthelmintic type plant secondary metabolites, the horses become stinky to the external parasites and the ticks don't like them. Our goats have a much higher demand for mineral content in their diet than the sheep do, or even than the horses do. And they eat so much copper that we never find ticks on our horses, but the livestock guard dogs that are living with those goats to protect them from predators are covered in ticks. This year we put wormwood, made a wormwood tea for the dogs, and now they aren't covered in ticks, and they're just drinking that as their water source. So things like that are a way that animals naturally can select plants in their environment to reduce their susceptibility to external parasites, flies, ticks, susceptibility to viruses, other pathogens, bacteria, and reduce the egg laying output of the parasites that they're carrying.
Okay, the next question. If we do not have access to a grazing situation, what is the best way to supplement?
So diversity, I would say, is and forage testing. Find out if you have an easy keeper that's too heavy and you're having to restrict the amount of food that they get, mix it with straw, add 10% of straw, and um, look at the body condition change of the horse on that. If it's not sufficient of a decline, um, add 15% straw to whatever it is that's available as hay that's being fed to them. And then there are people that sell herb buffets or various herbal. You could just go on Etsy and buy dried herbs of all different species, and people set those out for their horses to eat as they need them or as they want. And that can provide a diversity in their diet that they would not be getting from their hay um, without prescribing an amount. You let the horse choose the amount that it wants of the various plants that you're giving it. And that allows prevention of toxicities or interactions that make the horse reject the supplements that you're trying to get them to eat.
Okay, and I think this is the last question. How about leaving the grass as standing hay? Does the fall frost cause problems as far as sugar?
Um, if if you let grass get mature enough to essentially be standing hay, it's already seeded out, and that is a highly lignous, low available sugar type of forage. And the frost is not going to have an effect on that. The frost will have an effect on the tillers that are growing from those grasses because once grasses reproduce with their flowering parts, um, they often in the fall will send out tillers that grow that are vegetative, and those vegetative tillers can have um, issues with carbohydrate accumulation and protein accumulation that isn't metabolizable by the plant because of cold temperatures. And so they can get like purple leaves that show that the sugars are accumulated in the leaf tissue and haven't been moved down into the stem or the roots. And those can be detrimental to a horse that's on the edge of insulin resistance or is insulin resistant, and you can have tender hooves and foundering from that. So it's really important to make sure that if you are grazing your horses, they aren't in an insulin resistant state and that they're capable of handling the metabolic influx of a wide variety of plant compounds.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sherry. Before everyone logs off, I do have a poll. If you folks watching don't mind quickly taking that. It's just a little bit of feedback for the speaker series and tonight's talk by Sherry.